Has anyone ever accused you of being too emotional just to dismiss your pain?
There's a moment, right before you open a group message, when your gut already knows you're not supposed to be there. You see the preview, the bubbly tone, the inside jokes before you even open it fully, and somehow, you already feel the sting. That's what it was like when I tapped the family text thread that had just lit up my phone screen that Thursday morning. Looking forward to another amazing holiday at Rick's. Bring your best dish, we're going all out this year. Turkey, games, wine, and chaos, just like always. I stared at the sender list. It was all of them. Karen, Rick, Mom, even cousin Sarah, who hasn't spoken to me since 2017 when I ruined her engagement party by daring to ask if anyone else needed help setting up the chairs. I guess that was controversial in Carterland. But one name was missing. Mine. I didn't answer the message. I didn't have to. Because deep down, I already knew what this was. It wasn't the first time. In fact, it was the third year in a row. Third time I had to find out accidentally that everyone had plans together and no one thought to include me. The first time, I convinced myself it was a mistake. Maybe I'd missed an earlier text. Maybe they thought I was still in Europe, even though I'd moved back to the States 4 months prior. The second time, I swallowed my pride and called Karen, only to be told, with that syrupy sweet passive aggression she's perfected since high school, we just assumed you were busy with work like always. This time, I didn't bother calling her right away. I just sat there, phone in my hand, letting the silence in my apartment stretch like an echo chamber of every time I've been forgotten. People like to say family is forever, but they forget that forever can feel like a prison sentence when the people who are supposed to love you make you feel like a stranger at your own table. And here's the thing, I wasn't perfect. God knows I made mistakes. I didn't go to every birthday. I stayed in Portland longer than I meant to. I skipped Rick's wedding because I was going through a divorce and barely functioning. But I was there when our dad died. I booked the flights. I handled the paperwork. I sat beside our mother while she pretended to grieve, even though I knew she was more upset about what she'd wear to the memorial than the fact that her husband of 39 years was gone. I was the one who held it together. And somehow, that still didn't buy me a seat at the goddamn Thanksgiving table. That morning, I made coffee, poured it into the same chipped mug I've used for years, the one that says "World's Okayest Sister" that Karen gave me once as a joke, and opened my laptop. The wallpaper is a picture of Crater Lake. Peaceful, blue, quiet. The opposite of my family. I stared at the folder on my desktop that I hadn't opened in a long time. It was titled, "Just in Case I Go Nuclear." It had been a joke, or at least I told myself that. A place to store drafts of emails I'd never send. A few designs I made during my ad agency years when I used to imagine putting up a billboard outside Mom's country club with a message like, "She's not nice. She's just rich." Harmless catharsis, right? But something in me clicked that morning. Not a snap. Not an explosion. Just a cold, quiet click. The kind of decision that doesn't feel impulsive because it's been cooking on the back burner for a decade. I opened the folder. Inside were old pitch decks, mock-ups of campaigns I never used, a PDF of vendor contacts from the time I helped manage regional media buys for a sporting goods chain, and a sticky note I'd saved digitally with one line. You don't have to burn bridges when you can just reroute the traffic. I clicked through the documents like a surgeon checking their tools. Everything I'd need was there, not for a real job, not for client work, but for something else. Something personal. Something that would hit exactly where it hurts them most. Because if there's one thing the Carter family loves more than being together, it's being seen being together. Their whole life revolves around performance, the matching sweaters, the endless photo shoots, the captioned Instagrams, the stories posted from Rick's $1 million open-concept kitchen. And the center of it all? The Thanksgiving Cowboys game. Every year since we were kids, we'd watch it in the living room with Dad yelling at the TV, Mom pretending to care, Rick explaining plays no one asked about, and Karen showing off her Pinterest-level appetizers. That game was sacred. It was tradition. It was, I realized suddenly, my stage. And if they wouldn't invite me into the performance, maybe I'd hijack the script. At noon, I called Karen. Just to hear how she'd spin it this time. She answered on the second ring, breathless, like she'd been running from a confrontation she knew was coming. "Oh, Lisa, hey," she said, dragging out the hey like it would soften the blow. "I saw the message," I said, plain and direct. "Another year without me, huh?" There was a pause, just long enough to confirm everything. "I just thought, after last time, maybe you'd prefer not to come. I didn't want to put pressure on you." "You didn't want to what, Karen? Invite your own sister?" "I see," I said, my voice like steel wrapped in velvet. "Well, I hope you all have a lovely time." "Lisa, don't make this a thing," she rushed. "You know how intense you can get about holidays. It's supposed to be fun." That did it. That stupid word. Intense. That's what they always called me when I refused to play along. When I spoke up. When I didn't laugh at Rick's jokes or Mom's judgment or Karen's little digs. Not dramatic. Not emotional. Intense. As if existing fully made me defective. I hung up without saying another word. And then I pulled up my old contact list from my agency days, searched for a name I hadn't thought about in years. Trevor Santiago, Regional Media Coordinator for Channel 11 Dallas, and typed out a message that would start the chain reaction I'd been subconsciously plotting for most of my adult life. "Hey Trevor. Crazy idea. What's your current rate for a sponsored halftime ad during the Cowboys game?" He replied in under 5 minutes. And just like that, the game had begun. There's something uniquely cruel about a memory that arrives not as a warm echo, but as a gut punch disguised as nostalgia, and as I sat in my dimly lit apartment the following evening, the muted glow of the television screen reflecting off the kitchen tile, I found myself remembering the living room from our old house in Fort Worth, not the fancy one my mother curated for company, all glass figurines and white upholstery, but the real one, the back room with the sagging green couch and the outdated carpet that always smelled faintly of popcorn and dog hair, where every single Thanksgiving since I could form a sentence, we'd sit, side by side, pretending to be a family. Dad would be in his faded Cowboys hoodie, the one with the hole in the elbow, shouting at the screen as if the quarterback could hear him, with a cold beer balanced on the armrest and his voice just this side of hoarse by halftime. Karen would be on the floor, legs crossed like a cheerleader, not watching the game so much as performing attentiveness for whatever boyfriend she'd dragged along that year, always someone tall, beige, and just successful enough to pass my mother's approval radar. Rick would be glued to his phone, even back then, though in the early days it was a Game Boy or a Sports Illustrated, his presence more an obligation than a choice. And me? I was the extra piece, the fourth chair pulled in at the last minute, always expected to be grateful just to be there, to laugh politely at the jokes, to fetch the napkins, to keep my opinions to myself, especially when they veered anywhere near uncomfortable truths. It's funny how those years blended together, same dishes, same football game, same polite tension you could cut with a carving knife, and yet each one left a mark, a small dent in the armor I kept wrapping around myself year after year. I remember the year I told them I'd gotten promoted to creative director at the agency, a title I had bled for, spent nights in the office for, given up relationships for, and Karen responded with, "Oh wow, so you're like, in charge of colors and stuff?" While Rick smirked and Dad muttered something about how real success involves owning, not just managing, as if my hard-earned achievement was little more than arts and crafts. I remember looking at my mother that day, waiting for her to step in, to say anything that resembled pride or defense, but all she did was adjust her pearl necklace and ask if someone remembered to turn off the oven. That moment, like so many others, lodged itself somewhere behind my ribs and stayed there, quiet but heavy. And now, staring at my laptop, I could still see the way Karen's voice lifted when she spoke to Rick compared to when she spoke to me, the way our mother always reached for Rick's shoulder during family photos while leaving her hand carefully resting on the chair behind mine, not touching me, but close enough to create the illusion for the camera. There's a coldness you learn to live with when you're the one who doesn't fit the family's mold, and for a while, you tell yourself it's your fault, you work too much, you talk too much, you moved too far away, but then the years pile up. And you start to understand that maybe you were never meant to fit in because the space they left for you was never yours to begin with. And so, There I was, Thursday evening, 1 week before Thanksgiving, replaying those memories not because I enjoyed the pain they brought, but because they were fuel, each one another log tossed onto a fire I had been trying to put out for far too long. I needed to feel it all, every slight, every omission, every smug smirk from Rick, every veiled insult from Karen, every moment of disinterest from a mother who wore her social status like armor and treated my independence like a personal failure. Because this time, I wasn't going to swallow it. This time, I was going to serve it back, cold, curated, and delivered during their sacred, perfect, American holiday tradition. You see, the beauty of revenge, real revenge, is not in screaming or storming out or burning it all down in front of them. It's in the silence that follows when they realize you've outmaneuvered them, that you've turned their favorite thing into your platform, that the one person they tried so hard to edit out of the family narrative has suddenly taken control of the story. It didn't take long to confirm that the local Dallas broadcast of the Thanksgiving Cowboys game, the one they watched religiously from the comfort of Rick's 6-bedroom suburban fortress, offered sponsor slots for halftime segments. I didn't need a national audience. I didn't need to trend on Twitter. I just needed that living room, that couch, those faces frozen mid-bite when they saw it. 20 seconds of unskippable attention. That was all I needed. So I crafted the message the way only someone who has sat silently through decades of microaggressions can. Precise, measured, not angry but undeniable. No flames, no names, just 5 words said in clean, elegant typeface against a black screen. Brought to you by the daughter you forgot. Not signed. Not explained. Just dropped like a whisper in the middle of their perfect Thanksgiving broadcast. Because here's what they never understood. While they were busy polishing their image and curating their lives for social media and neighbors and dinner party guests, I was watching, collecting, remembering. I never needed their approval. I just needed one moment where they would look up and realize they'd pushed me so far outside the frame that I had to buy my way back in, not to belong, but to remind them I exist. And if I was going to spend this holiday alone again, with my store-bought stuffing and bottle of wine and heat from frozen pie, then so be it. But this time, they were going to see me. Not on a Zoom call. Not through a last-minute text. But on the screen they never looked away from. Right there. Between beer commercials and turkey talk. I wasn't going to crash their dinner. I was going to haunt their halftime. There's a point at which an idea stops being a fantasy or a harmless daydream and starts to root itself into your bones like purpose, growing stronger every time you think about it, until eventually it becomes something so real, so solid and undeniable, that it no longer feels like revenge, it feels like justice, long overdue and perfectly calibrated. That was exactly where I found myself the moment I got Trevor Santiago's reply, short and to the point, almost clinical in its bland professionalism. 20-second sponsor slot for halftime. Regional broadcast, 50,000 flat. Creative due 3 business days in advance. Payment upfront. He didn't ask why someone with no product, no company, and no public brand wanted a halftime spot. He didn't care, or if he did, he'd worked in media long enough to know that the best clients were the ones who paid without questions and kept their motives to themselves. $50,000. Not 20. Not 30. Not something small enough to laugh off if it went unnoticed. No, 50,000 was the kind of number that stops you. The kind that tests your conviction, especially when it's not corporate money or business funds, but your own, personal, private, pulled straight from savings you spent years telling yourself was for emergencies you never defined clearly. Was this an emergency? No. It was something sharper. It was a reclamation. It was decades of swallowing my pride and my voice until I finally decided I was done pretending that being silent was the same thing as being strong. I stared at my online banking dashboard for a long time, dragging the cursor over the transfer button like I was teetering on the edge of a cliff, except I didn't feel scared. I felt calm. Cold, even. There was something about knowing exactly what you're doing and why, even when no one else would understand, that creates a kind of inner stillness. I transferred the full amount into a new account under a single-purpose LLC I registered that same night, Forgotten and Company, a name that made me laugh out loud for the first time in days. Not because it was funny in a haha sense, but because it was so precisely on the nose it felt like an inside joke between me and the universe. If anyone ever looked up the transaction, it would look legitimate, clean, like any other local business trying to push some vague awareness play. And that's exactly what I wanted. Because this wasn't about humiliation or spectacle. It wasn't about blowing up their lives or forcing some public apology they'd never deliver. I didn't want their embarrassment. I wanted their discomfort. I wanted them to squirm, not because they were being exposed, but because they'd have to sit in the knowledge that someone they thought they'd erased had found a way to write herself back into the script. Quietly, unapologetically, and with style. The message design was simple, black screen, white serif font, centered, slow fade in, no music, no voiceover, no animation. I timed it to last exactly 20 seconds, giving the words enough space to settle on the screen like a whisper that somehow felt louder than any scream. Brought to you by the daughter you forgot. That was it. No logo. No signature. No next steps. Because when you've been deliberately excluded long enough, you stop wanting invitations and start wanting acknowledgement. Even if it comes in the form of confusion, even if they never admit they saw it, I knew that for at least 20 seconds, they would have to sit with the discomfort of recognizing themselves in that message. I hit send on the final creative file and payment confirmation late Monday night, 2 days before Thanksgiving, and as the file uploaded to the secure Dropbox Trevor had sent me, I sat back in my chair, listening to the soft hum of my old refrigerator and the occasional rumble of traffic outside my window, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was waiting for someone to choose me. I had chosen myself. The next morning, I woke up to an email confirmation, slot approved, content scheduled, airtime locked. I stared at the screen for a long time, the way you might look at an open door after living in a locked room for most of your life, unsure if you're really allowed to step through it or if it's some kind of trick. But I wasn't afraid anymore. Not of them. Not of being judged. Not even of being ignored again. Because this wasn't about winning a seat at their table, it was about pulling the tablecloth right out from under their curated little display of what a perfect family looks like and reminding them that the pieces don't all stay upright when you yank away the foundation. It wasn't until later that evening, when I was heating up soup I didn't really want and scrolling mindlessly through my phone, that my mother called me, her name flashing on the screen like a ghost from a dream I hadn't consented to revisit. I stared at it for a few rings, debating whether to let it go to voicemail, but something told me to answer, not because I wanted to hear her voice, but because I needed to. I pressed accept, and before I could say hello, her voice came through, sharp and cold and wrapped in the kind of indignation that only shows up when a person realizes, too late, that the control they once had is slipping. "Lisa," she said, using my full name like she was summoning a child, "did you do something to the football game?" There it was. Not hi, not how are you, not even what on earth happened. Just suspicion. Accusation. Control dressed up as concern. I didn't answer her question. I didn't need to. I let the silence stretch, just long enough to make her uncomfortable. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said finally, my tone so even it startled even me. "Is there a problem with the game?" Another pause. A beat too long. The sound of her breath tightening. And then, with all the venom she could manage while still keeping her mask on, she said, "If this is some sort of stunt, Lisa, I suggest you think very carefully about what kind of attention you're inviting." And just like that, it was confirmed. She had seen it. Or at the very least, someone had told her. The crack had formed. The mask was slipping. "I think I've done plenty of thinking," I replied, calm, measured, not angry but unyielding. "Enjoy the holiday." And I hung up. I sat there for a long time afterward, not triumphant, not giddy, just steady, like someone who had finally finished a chapter she'd been forced to keep rereading her whole life. They saw it. They knew. And whether they acknowledged it out loud or pretended it never happened, I had spoken in a language they couldn't mute, during a moment they never looked away from. And I was only getting started. There's a very specific kind of satisfaction that settles over you when the people who have spent years underestimating you suddenly realize that, despite all their carefully rehearsed dismissals, You were always more dangerous than they thought. Not because you're loud or volatile or reckless, but because you were quiet long enough to learn exactly where to press the blade. And that's what I felt in the days immediately following the Thanksgiving game, a slow, humming, almost holy sense of calm that came not from any dramatic confrontation or cathartic scream, but from the silence that followed, the kind of heavy, charged silence that speaks volumes without anyone having to say a word. It was the silence of being seen without consent, of having your narrative interrupted by someone they thought they'd successfully edited out years ago. I knew they watched the game. That was never in question. They always did same couch, same snacks, same wine that my sister Karen insisted on chilling for exactly 22 minutes before pouring it into those pretentious crystal goblets she got from their wedding registry, because apparently, proper aeration meant something when you were performing joy in front of guests. I knew they'd be there, phones down, eyes forward, wrapped in attention during those familiar halftime moments when the food coma kicks in and conversation dwindles and the television becomes the centerpiece again. And I knew down to my bones that they saw it. The black screen. The white letters. The message delivered with surgical precision. What I didn't fully anticipate was how quickly the quiet rage would start bleeding through the seams of their public restraint, how the perfectly curated image would start to crack, not in grand explosions but in small, pointed ruptures that felt even more satisfying to witness. Karen was the first to break formation. She left a voicemail the next morning, her voice laced with that special kind of high-pitched anger that only someone who's been deeply embarrassed can muster while still trying to sound composed. Lisa, I don't know what kind of sick attention grab this was, but you really crossed a line. I mean, what kind of person hijacks a family holiday to broadcast their drama to half of Texas? You need to get over yourself and grow up. I didn't respond, of course, not because I didn't have things to say. God knows I could have written her a monologue that would make her ears burn for the rest of the year, but because I knew, with absolute certainty, that silence would wound her more deeply than anything I could say. Karen thrives on conflict when she controls the narrative, but take that away and she flails. She needs the last word. Denying her that was sweeter than any insult I could have delivered. Then came Rick, my ever-silent brother, whose version of communication involves either sarcasm or nothing at all. He didn't call. He didn't text. Instead, he posted a not-so-subtle status update on Facebook. Family means showing up, not showing off. No tags, no direct reference, but plenty of likes from mutual friends and extended relatives who no doubt knew exactly what he was referring to, even if they didn't know the whole story. I saw it, of course, I see everything, always have, because when you've spent your life on the outskirts, you learn to watch closely, to notice the shifts in tone, the quiet digs, the coded messages. Mom's reaction was less visible, but no less predictable. True to form, she didn't call again. Instead, I received a formal-looking email the following day. Yes, email. Subject line, concerning recent behavior. It was cold, sterile, and clearly composed after careful drafting. She expressed her deep disappointment in my choice to inject tension into a day meant for unity and peace, and concluded by suggesting that perhaps it's time we both reflect on the roles we've played in this ongoing estrangement. Not once did she ask if I was okay. Not once did she acknowledge that I'd been excluded in the first place. Just another attempt to twist the story into something that painted her as the wounded matriarch and me as the volatile exile. But amid the predictable outrage, there was one message that landed differently, one unexpected voice that cut through the noise with something close to kindness. Aunt Sylvia, my mother's older sister, had always been the only adult who treated me like I wasn't defective, who looked me in the eye when I spoke and listened with more than just polite tolerance. I hadn't seen her in years, not since the last Thanksgiving I was invited to, when she pulled me aside after dinner and whispered, "You don't have to keep trying to fit into a puzzle that keeps changing shape to exclude you." She sent me a short text after the game aired. Saw the ad. "Proud of you. You've always been the brave one." It stopped me cold. Not because I needed validation. I had done what I did for myself, not for applause, but because it reminded me that somewhere, in all that noise and resentment, someone had seen me clearly, maybe even from the beginning. And then, of course, came the ripple effect, the secondary wave of attention I hadn't expected, but should have predicted in an age where everything is captured, shared, dissected. A screenshot of the halftime message started making its way through Twitter and Reddit, first as a curiosity, then as a mystery, and finally as a symbol. "Who is the forgotten daughter?" one headline read. "Halftime ad sparks family drama the internet can't stop talking about." And just like that, I became a story. Not just to them, but to strangers. People began speculating, some treating it like a publicity stunt, others projecting their own pain onto it, sharing stories of family estrangement, gaslighting, emotional exile. I received messages, hundreds of them, from people I didn't know, from places I'd never been, all saying the same thing in different ways. "Thank you for speaking the words I've carried in silence for years." And that's when I realized something important. My message hadn't just reached the living room I'd targeted. It had reached countless others, people I'd never meet, who'd sat at similar tables with similar wounds. My private pain had echoed into something larger, something collective, something necessary. I hadn't just reminded my family that I existed. I had reminded an entire unseen demographic that their pain was valid. Of course, none of that mattered to Karen, or Rick, or my mother. To them, I was still the problem. Still the one who couldn't just let things go. Still the one who had to make everything about herself. But they could say whatever they wanted in their dining room circles and prayer brunches and suburban cocktail hours, because I knew the truth. I had told it in the most visible, inescapable way possible. And I had done it without yelling. Without crashing the party. Without lifting a single finger in their direction. All I did was buy 20 seconds of their attention. And I had more where that came from. There's a strange stillness that settles in once the chaos dies down, once the phone stops buzzing and the novelty of the scandal starts to fade from the public eye, leaving behind only the long, echoing silence of the consequences that no longer feel hypothetical but fully realized and irreversible, like footprints hardened in concrete, too deep to erase and too permanent to ignore. That was the space I found myself inhabiting in the days after the ad aired. Not quite triumphant, but certainly not regretful, existing in this odd limbo where everything had changed and yet, on the surface, nothing looked all that different. My apartment was still the same, quiet and sparse. The cold mornings still greeted me with the hum of my coffee machine and the pale gray light through the blinds, and my family, true to form, had resumed their performance of normalcy like professionals, rehearsing a play where I had never existed in the first place. But something had shifted, and not just in them, though their discomfort was evident in the pointed silences, the passive-aggressive social media posts, and the carefully crafted emails that felt more like veiled legal warnings than messages between blood relatives. No, the real shift was in me, in the way I walked, the way I answered the phone, the way I looked at myself in the mirror with an unfamiliar kind of steadiness that came not from vengeance or validation, but from the quiet knowledge that, for once, I hadn't swallowed my own truth for the sake of keeping the peace. The internet had done what the internet does. It took something deeply personal, chewed it up, and spat it out into the public consciousness, where it became a meme, a mystery, a moment of collective catharsis. People speculated. Some thought it was a stunt, some called it brilliant, others dismissed it as petty or attention-seeking, and a few even reached out offering book deals or interview spots or podcast guest appearances, hungry to feed off the emotional spectacle of a woman daring to say, publicly and without apology, "You hurt me, and I am done pretending that you didn't." I ignored them all. Because this wasn't a brand. This wasn't content. This was my life, carved open and broadcast for 20 seconds in the middle of a football game, and, while I didn't regret a second of it, I wasn't interested in turning it into entertainment for the masses. Still, I couldn't deny the impact. The messages poured in, most of them from strangers, men and women, young and old, people who had been cut out of wills, uninvited to weddings, erased from Christmas cards, edited out of family albums, people who had dared to be different, to speak up, to challenge the roles they were assigned and paid the price for their disobedience with silence, distance, and emotional exile. They wrote to say thank you. They wrote to say they wept. They wrote to say they had never seen their experience reflected back to them in such a simple, devastating way. And even though I hadn't done it for them, their voices filled something in me I hadn't realized was still hollow. But of course, the people I truly wanted to hear from never said the things I needed to hear. Karen continued her campaign of plausible deniability, insisting to anyone who asked that she had no idea what Lisa's problem is and that some people just can't move on. Rick, predictably, stayed quiet, his silence wrapped in the smugness of someone who thinks being unbothered is the same thing as being right. My mother, ever the martyr, sent one final message, a handwritten letter, delivered by certified mail no less, in which she expressed her heartbreak that I had chosen, as she put it, a public spectacle over private reconciliation, and reminded me, in a tone that was almost tender if you didn't look too closely, that I had always had a tendency toward dramatics. She didn't apologize. She didn't acknowledge what they'd done. She didn't ask me to come home. Instead, she signed off with the words, "I hope you find peace, even if it's not with us," and for the first time in my life, I didn't cry after reading something she wrote. I just folded the letter, placed it in a drawer, and went on with my day. It wasn't closure, not really. Closure implies something has ended, been resolved, packed neatly into a box you can store away and never revisit. This wasn't that. This was a fracture that had always existed, finally brought into the light and acknowledged for what it was: ugly, painful, and real. And while I had no illusion that I'd healed the wound, I had at least stopped pretending it wasn't there. A few days later, I walked into a grocery store down the street, the kind with flickering overhead lights and slightly overpriced produce, and while I was standing in the checkout line, I overheard two women talking behind me. They didn't know me. They weren't looking at me. They were just chatting, casual and half distracted, but their words stuck with me. "Did you see that thing during the game?" one of them said, her voice low. "That message from the daughter? I don't know who she is, but damn. I felt that." The other woman laughed softly, not unkindly. "Yeah, good for her. Sometimes you have to remind people you're not going to stay invisible forever." They didn't say anything else. They paid for their groceries and left, unaware that the person they were talking about had been standing 3 feet in front of them, holding a carton of eggs and a bottle of wine, feeling more seen in that moment than she had during a lifetime of holiday dinners combined. And as I walked home, wind sharp against my face, I thought about what it meant to be remembered, not by the people who were supposed to love you, but by those who understood you without even knowing your name. I didn't know if I'd ever speak to my family again. I didn't know if they'd ever stop pretending the whole thing never happened. I didn't know if, next Thanksgiving, I'd feel the same urge to remind them of my existence. But I did know this: I had stepped out of the shadows. I had claimed my place in the story. I had spoken in a language they could not mute. And whether they watched the screen in horror or disbelief or denial, they watched. I know they did. Because for 20 seconds, they weren't in control. I was. They left me out of the reunion. So I made sure they remembered me. And I never even had to raise my voice.